Hello and welcome back to today's lecture series on reception and ancient art. And in this section, I'm going to be talking about the Renaissance and the sort of rediscovery and rebirth of the classical mode in the Renaissance period, and J.J. Winckelmann, the father of art history, and his perception of the way that we should think about the classical world. So I want to start by discussing a little bit about the way that some of the major monuments of the classical world were discovered. And I know this is something a little bit of a review of things we've discussed before. But during the Renaissance period and the medieval period, of course, some of the monuments of the Roman world and the Greek world stayed where they were. They were large enough not to be buried by strata of soil that were building up and could be repurposed, built upon, turned into housing, turned into churches. There are various things that you could do with these existing structures. Alternatively, you could mine out a lot of the decorative stuff, especially if it was marble. That includes revetment, statuary, floor coverings. Burn that, turn it into lime, and then you get lots more mortar for building activities. So a lot of the material from the classical world was lost during the medieval period, up even into the early modern period, through that process of lime burning and sort of spoliation for purposes of new building and new construction. Um, and then at some point during the Renaissance period, people started rediscovering more pristine, buried areas of the antique world. And one example of this is the Domus Aurea in the center of the city of Rome. So Nero's Golden House, one of the most fabulous imperial villa palaces that was ever built, that was constructed right on the heart of the city, that was burnt down by the Great Fire in 64 CE. And so the Domus Aurea became a site where people could kind of concentrate their dislike of the emperor. It became a monument of the way that he would take the destruction wrought by a disaster that happened on his watch and then use it for personal gain by co-opting that land, using a large part of it to create an artificial lake, building a pleasure palace that made the center of the city feel like the countryside, but was only for the use of the emperor and his central circle. So after Nero's death and disgrace and the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the Domus Aurea was covered over. A large parts of it were destroyed. The artificial lake at the center, that area was used to build the Colosseum eventually. So repurposing again that land from slums to Imperial Palace, Pleasure Lake to our amphitheater of the people, where the might of the empire works for and gives things to the people rather than keeping it for itself. But the Domus Aurea, parts of the structure were reused and built into the foundations of the Trajanic baths later on. And so during the medieval period, a youth kind of fell into a crevice in the side of the Esquiline Hill and ended up basically inside a grotto-like space, which was a filled version of one of these enormous rooms you can see inside the Domus Aurea here. The scale is quite inhuman. It dwarfs you when you're in there, and the paintings go all the way up. That idea of sort of detail beyond what you can see that we've seen in monuments like Trajan's Column is on full display in the Domus Aurea. But at the time, that these rooms were largely filled in with a sort of grotto-like area, and you could explore these by lamplight. So we get stories of Renaissance artists and sort of urban explorers of their time going into these spaces and rediscovering the artwork of the period. The Domus Aurea is one of them, with its beautiful sort of grotesque fourth style paintings. And these start to show up and be reinterpreted through the lens of these Renaissance era artists. So we see things like the Laocoon group. So this is probably a Hellenistic or a Roman copy of a Hellenistic statue that depicts the priest of Troy and his two sons attempting to warn the Trojans not to bring the Trojan horse into their city walls and getting punished by the gods who are on the side of the Greeks. And so the Laocoon sculpture, we have documentation that it was viewed by Michelangelo shortly after its discovery. It is supposedly discovered on the grounds of the Esquiline. That might be doubtful. There are even some conspiracy theories that Michelangelo faked this statue and carved it himself. But we see in his drawings even an interest here in capturing the sort of vivacity of these Hellenistic and Roman sculptures, and looking at the detail of the musculature and reinterpreting that. So we have this sketch here that he has done of the head of Laocoon from this sculpture from 1530. So we see the contemporary artists of the Renaissance period really looking closely and learning from the classical art that they are encountering out in the world. So with keeping with Michelangelo here, another way in which Renaissance artists sort of interpreted and worked with antiquity draws on that idea of the monuments that had a long enough life, a continuous biography, didn't disappear below ground, but continued to exist alongside the daily life of the medieval period and late antiquity in Rome and in Roman areas. And during the Renaissance period, some of these objects were then repurposed and reused in new contexts. So we see that at the Piazza del Campidoglio, one of the most famous monuments constructed by Michelangelo, or designed by Michelangelo, and then constructed over a fairly long period of time before it reached his vision. And we see these the buildings that are now the Capitoline Museum on either side, and they flank this oval piazza with its kind of wonderful geometric design that makes your eyes sort of travel all about. And here are some other views. Here you can see the central pedestal here is blank in this version from above. You can see the way that it kind of embraces you and draws you into this piazza area. And then as you move up the stairs to get there, we have this wonderful, shallow, lengthy staircase leading up to the Campidoglio Piazza. And at the center of the piazza was placed this equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, which was preserved because it was misinterpreted as a statue of the Christian emperor Constantine the Great. So when a lot of the statuary and artistic works from classical antiquity that dealt with pagan emperors were destroyed by iconoclastic Christians during the medieval period, a lot of material was kept because it was thought to pertain to the sort of early origins of Christianity and its acceptance as a religious movement. So in this case, people thought that this statue of Marcus Aurelius, that we can now sort of identify more securely, it is bronze, was of the Christian emperor. It was then used by Michelangelo. It existed in Rome forever, and then it was incorporated by Michelangelo into the center of the Campidoglio Piazza. And he is giving this gesture of ad locutio, right, of the emperor talking to the people. But it also, again, kind of recalls the later Christian gesture of blessing as well. So you can see that kind of resonance and the ability for you to, again, reinterpret this art through a different perspective and see something in it that perhaps wasn't intended by the original creators. We also see just a large-scale inspiration, right? So we have certain pieces of ancient artwork that proved very inspirational and drew the eye of a lot of famous artists. So one of these is the Belvedere torso, now in the Vatican Museums in Rome. And this is a wonderful ancient piece because it is signed very prominently by Apollonius, son of Nestor, Athenian, right here on the front. It's hard to see the inscription in this picture, but very prominent artistic signature, unusual for our ancient art, as you know. And so the Belvedere torso was proved sort of a fascinating piece with its hypermusculature to a lot of Renaissance artists. We can see here it is from the back. Here's another view of the front with that little inscription that you can see. So this real emphasis on the sort of male form, the curvature of the spine, looking at the way that muscles shift in response to movement, an appreciation for the rippling, contoured form of the human body here that proved extremely inspirational. And we see very similar things show up in the works, say, of Michelangelo across all sorts of different media. Here we have him working in clay, paper, and marble. We see that sort of fascination with the musculature on all sides, the curvature of the spine, the way that bodies respond to movement, showing up also in these works of Michelangelo. Although with the sort of additional layer that shows up in the Renaissance of an interest in the anatomical precision of what is going on underneath the skin as well, right? So in the Roman period, we don't, at least we don't have a huge record for people doing things like dissections to better understand the anatomy of the human body in order to draw, but we do have that with our Renaissance artists like Michelangelo. So perhaps taking that classical, the aims of classical art even further. And here's just kind of a supercut of more Michelangelo works, all of which sort of recall that twisting or muscled form of the Belvedere torso. In this case, this is a statue, drawing of a statue of Apollo that is given a lot more musculature than the ancient version of statues of Apollo were, kind of incorporating that hypermusculature and masculinity into a context where in antiquity it probably wouldn't exist so much, as we saw Apollo and Dionysus are both figures who tend to have a little bit more of a feminine or lithe physique rather than that heroic muscular build. So at the end of the Renaissance, we move out of this period of artistic creation that is the topic of many art history courses. So as you can see, I'm blowing through it very rapidly. But we also, in the 18th century, in the late 18th century, we sort of see the rise of art history as a discipline in and of itself. And that comes partly out of the work of this man named Johann Joachim Winckelmann. He is a German author, archaeologist, art historian, writer, one of these sort of wealthy polymaths of the 18th century. And he writes a book called The History of the Art of Antiquity. This is just another book that he wrote, so I can show you an actual printed copy of one of his works. And his History of the Art of Antiquity is one of these sort of foundational texts of the art historical discipline, and it is really fascinated with looking at the sublime architecture of classical art. So Winckelmann doesn't just interpret, look at, and kind of try and understand the art of the ancient world. He also, to some extent, idolizes it and approaches it in a way that sets up some of the problems in the art historical approach to the classical world that we discussed early on in the semester, and that last a very long time. And what he sort of does is he really idolizes, theoretically, the Greek artists, the idea that the Greek art is this kind of paradigm of what is good in artistic works. But he mostly is looking at Roman works, which he calls copies. And so he kind of is creating in his mind this idealized, invisible Greek original that is perfect, although he can only sort of see the inferior Roman copies. So he's writing about something that he's as much creating in his imagination as able to inspect in person, and doing this in a way that to us now as sort of contemporary art historian looks a little bit uncritical. Of course, he's, a foundational disciplinary figure, so give him his due. He's creating something whole new here. So we see, unfortunately, that idea about the superiority of Greek art over Roman art, that really holds tenuously through the discipline for a very long time. It's something that I firmly disagree with, especially because I think kind of the popular style of Roman art is really compelling and exciting, as well as things like Minoan art and Etruscan art, so things that depart a little bit from the Attic classical paradigm stylistically, I think are maybe even more interesting than the traditional classical art. As you know me. So we have Winckelmann kind of setting up this paradigm, and he, of course, doesn't have access to a lot of the things that we've discovered archaeologically since then that are Greek originals, like Greek bronzes that are brought up from shipwrecks, right? He could not see those. So he's kind of working off of this imaginary corpus and discussing things. One work that he does love a lot is the Belvedere torso. And he approaches this work with a kind of rapturousness that I think really captures that kind of idealization and idolization of Greek art, that maybe crosses the line a little bit into lack of criticality. I think you should read this on your own because I don't have too much time, but here's just a tiny excerpt. I'll do my Winckelmann voice. Like the bare trunk of a grand old oak which has been felled and shorn of its branches and boughs, the statue of the hero sits, mangled and mutilated, heads, legs, and arms, and the upper part of the breast gone. The first glance will perhaps discover to you nothing more than a misshapen stone, but if you are able to penetrate into the mysteries of art, you will behold one of its miracles if you contemplate this with a quiet eye. So, With that said, what I want you to do is to check out one of the resources provided in your last week's responses, response to lecture 6, by where you linked a piece of media, and write a 2 to 3 sentence response to the way that that piece interprets the past. Some questions to think about might include: when did this topic enter the conversation about antiquity? How is it usually interpreted? On the site provided, is there some